Hi everyone. Welcome to part 2 of my lecture about Shakespeare, early modern period, leading into the Tempest. My little helper is still here. He's a little crabbier. He might want some snacks. It's a little later in the day. So I left off talking about the Playhouses and a little bit about the history of the Globe Theater. I mean, if we were in class right now, this would be the part where I ask you all to think about what does the title Globe mean to you? Why do you think that the King's Men Company elected to call their playhouse the Globe? What are the metaphorical associations that brings up for you? And yeah, what is the Globe have to do with the theater? So maybe we'll be able to talk about that in class. But at this time, yeah, a lot of the playhouses were built outside city walls, and here's the official city wall in this little image here. So you can see the Globe is just across, this is the Thames River, Thames, and the Globe is just across the river, although it is within walking distance to St. Paul's Cathedral and some of the other, and the Tower of London is just down, where a lot of political prisoners were held, is just down the river. So there were two kinds of playhouses. The Globe was a massive outdoor public amphitheater. It can seat thousands of people. And we'll talk about the different sort of class rankings of those people in a second. And then there were more elite indoor private playhouses or halls, which would be, like I was just saying, like where the aristocrats would be taking, or be hosting their gala affairs, like the Met Gala, except with, a group of players. Sometimes the players tended to be young, sort of teenage boys. Something you may have heard of is that women were never on the stage at this time, and that isn't entirely true. It would be like a young teenage boy whose voice hasn't broken, who can sort of speak sounds and maybe looks very feminine, who would be playing the female characters in Shakespeare. So, and sometimes, Shakespeare plays with that, and there's a lot of sort of gender bending and a lot of jokes that emerge precisely from the fact that these are men playing women. And I think, so it's not something that is, Shakespeare is not self-conscious about. Yeah, the Globe was constructed 1599. It was burned down a couple times. For example, during a performance of Henry VIII in 1639, because I think a cannon went off during the production and burned it down. So that sucks. But it is still there today. Definitely, if you make it to London, you should go. This slide, I think is more useful to think about the different levels of the theater, and you can see that if you had money, even though this is an outdoor playhouse, which means that it was sort of a little more open to the public and, the lower classes, you can still, if you were of a higher rank, and didn't want to rub shoulders with those, like, dirty working class people, you could buy a seated ticket up in the rafters here, but then you wouldn't be as close to the stage, which is out here. The sky is the ceiling. I mean, this meant that most productions, because this is before electric lighting was developed, most productions would happen during the day. You can read a little bit more about the particular. Sorry, I'm trying to move this thing over. Yeah. And also, if you paid tickets to sit in these rafters, you would have a roof over you, which I guess would protect you from the weather. Although there was a roof over the stage called the Heavens as well, for the actors to be a little bit protected in case it started to rain or drizzle during a performance. But you may have heard of these. So if you go to the Globe today, still standing, still putting on Shakespeare productions, you can pay £5 and become and purchase a ticket to see the play play as what is known as a groundling. So it's kind of exactly how it sounds. The groundlings would stand on the ground underneath the sky and paid much, much less, so just like a couple pence or something, to attend the theater. So that means that it was actually quite affordable. And I suppose the Netflix of the 17th century, in that everyone would try to plan to go, and it was actually within your means. I mentioned briefly in the last video that playhouses, because they were open to such a mix of classes, they were also noisy, disruptive. People would try to sell their stuff to you. People would steal from you. There would be prostitutes. There were associations with other very popular activities at the time, which was animal baiting, so or cockfighting. These other kinds of sort of games that people would bet on, as well as brothels and taverns, were all also kind of in the neighborhood. They were often closed due to outbreaks of plague. Again, we can relate to that now. The theaters are only now starting to open up again, which is great, but of course you can't really be in such close proximity to people if there's a highly contagious and deathly disease in the air. And I'm wondering if there's anything else there's sort of a crisis of these masterless men, but you probably don't need to know about that. So, yeah, only no women on the stage, although it is perhaps notable that in the more ritzy productions, some aristocrats would actually dress up. Queen Elizabeth and her ladies would act in these elaborate skits known as masks. There's actually a mask in Act 4 of The Tempest, so we're going to be kind of picturing and encountering some of this extravagant production value, and trying to imagine what it would have looked like originally. So it's just like the masks are just high spectacle factor with really elaborate staging and backdrops and machinery around them. And so I think like the royalty would have sort of fun getting dressed up and performing in these. So that would be kind of the only time when you have women on the stages, during one of these sort of spectacle heavy mask productions. This is just a picture of a private theater, so as opposed to the outdoor more public theater. And this is a reconstruction. If you ever make it to Stanton, Virginia, I've never seen this, but the Blackfriars Theater is the most famous one that was associated with Shakespeare's company. And so sometimes you can actually tell, because a play will have a more intimate feel to it. It's kind of hard to describe, but you can see that this is lit by candlelight, so you could have a production in the evening, and it's much smaller. Like, it would hold less than 1,000 people, rather than about 10,000 would sit in the Globe Theater. So you can imagine this is a little bit more expensive, and also, this is the kind of setting where you would have people dressing up in their best garb and kind of showing off and sitting on the stage as well. So it's always sort of interesting to think about these original settings and different plays being written for either the outdoor stage. I mean, for example, The Tempest, the fact that we're in the Globe is explicitly mentioned and referenced in I think Act 5 of the play by Prospero, so it probably was performed in the Globe, versus sometimes you can tell that the play might feel a little bit more claustrophobic, and then you're like, oh, maybe this was originally written for an indoor theater. And of course, then that brings us even further into theater history, which is like, there was no script as we know it now. Like, in many cases, I think each actor was given their own part, and then they had to kind of improvise, and it was very much a collaborative production. And that brings us actually to the next point, which is about Shakespeare's own plays, and how there was no definitive edition of Shakespeare's plays during his lifetime. So he died in 1616, but you may have heard of the First Folio. I believe that the New York Public Library on 42nd Street owns a First Folio. Certainly the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., where I was fortunate enough to study during my PhD, they have a First Folio as well. So it's a limited edition of compiled by a lot of Shakespeare's friends who kind of said, like, okay, there's this company, there's this really brilliant playwright, we need to make sure that we write all these plays down. So they were only really definitively written down after he was dead, and that's why the first folio is so famous. Because if we didn't have it, you know, there are a number of plays that may have been lost. Previously, there might be what's known as quarto editions, so it refers to the pagination, whether it's a folio or a quarto. The folios are much larger, so it's like a piece of paper folded in half once, versus the quarto, which is folded over a couple times, and that is what is a quarto. Those may have been actually used by actors and kind of passed around, and you know, they were known as stolen and surreptitious copies, sometimes containing the name of the playing company, not Shakespeare himself. All right, so we have 5 minutes, I guess, to talk about the Tempest. I think, of course, this always takes so much longer than I expect. This play, speaking of the folio, it is, well, in the first folio, it is listed as a comedy, which you might know means that everyone gets married at the end, versus a tragedy where everyone dies at the end. However, in, I believe, the 19th century, 1875, someone sort of circled a number of Shakespeare's late plays and said, okay, these are a little bit different. We can't just call these plays a comedy. It's not the same as Midsummer Night's Dream because we can see elements of both tragedy and comedy. And there's a little bit, and there are other features such as, I just talked about the masks. These plays contain spectacular sets and stage effects, magical elements, dream settings, and storms. Some scholars argue they deal with themes of faith and redemption and rewarding virtue over vice. So this guy said, like, okay, let's call this a romance. And of course, we just finished studying a number of medieval romances. This is, again, even the word romance is an highly malleable word that we see throughout literary history, which even here doesn't, I mean, there are romance as in, you know, man and woman fall in love type elements, certainly in the Tempest, but it also would have meant something a little bit different as well. It was mentioned in class really briefly that Shakespeare himself sort of may have identified it with Prospero here, and here's the statue of him in Westminster Abbey that was erected 1740. And you can see, this is Shakespeare, but on this scroll that he's holding, there's a line from Prospero: the cloud-wrapped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit shall dissolve, and like the baseless fabric of a vision, leave not a wreck behind, a wreck being shipwreck, like we just found in Act 1, Scene 1. So pretty interesting already how we can see that the play is being related to all of life and society as we know it, and the stage becomes representative or metonymic of all of Earth. And this guy, Coleridge, also thought that Prospero was the very Shakespeare himself. It wasn't, some consider Tempest his last play, but he actually collaborated a little bit afterwards. The Globe is mentioned, but originally it still may have been written for the indoor Blackfriars Theater, lit by chandeliers. James I was actually even more of a fan of masks than Queen Elizabeth, so I think this is also why there is a mask involved in this play. Pardon me if I said misspoke earlier, that it was this was written in 1610, not 1605 or something. And the designs were designed by someone famous named Inigo Jones. If you look through the slides, you can click on this link and learn more about him, one of the first actual known costume designers. And this is a picture, for instance, of one of the designs for the sets. All right, we only have a minute left because this machine cuts me off at 15 minutes of my lectures, which is probably a good thing because students can't sit through much more than that anyway. So we need to talk more about this whole issue of colonization, global exploration. You know already that this is a play that explicitly addresses those issues, especially specifically through the character of Caliban. Shakespeare may have been inspired by this contemporary account of a shipwreck in Bermuda, and also of this essay by Michael de Montaigne of the Cannibals, and we'll start to talk about how British society is also critiqued through this exploration of other countries. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk more in class.